Well, good morning, folks. Welcome to our webinar, The Value of Energy Storage for Community Choice Agencies, their customers, and the grid. This is our second in a series of community choice and integrated distributed energy resources, second out of 4. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the webinar. We want to thank our sponsors, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation and the Adobe Foundation. Jonathan Logan for general support of our Clean Power Exchange program and these webinars, and the Adobe Foundation for this series of 4 webinars focusing on community choice and distributed energy resources. And you'll hear more about that from our project partners in a moment. You see 2 logos at the bottom. Center for Climate Protection is the organization, and the Clean Power Exchange is the program for community choice energy. And your webinar team today, myself, Woody Hastings, Energy Program Manager for the Center for Climate Protection, Nina Turner, our Energy Program Associate, who will be helping out with the questions and answers at the tail end of the webinar. The Adobe project team includes Michael Clausen, Julie Allingham, and Barry Vesser, and you'll be hearing from Julie Allingham today a little bit more about the project. And our presenters today are Rick Brown, PhD, President of TerraVerde Energy, and Cordel Stillman, Director of Programs for Sonoma Clean Power. As a time saver, I am not going to go into their bios. The bios are attached in the handout section on your control panel. And so a little bit more housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so that will be available for you for all attendees, and it will be available on our cleanpowerexchange.org website. Everyone will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. You can enter your questions, and we do want you to enter your questions in the control panel at any time during the webinar. And the questions and answers will be in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. And so the handouts that we do have today, the presenter bios, as I mentioned, we have a sheet of energy storage resources for community choice agencies, and a piece written by Barry Vesser of our team, getting ahead of the IDER wave. And then the recording of this webinar and the slide decks that you'll see today will be posted at Clean Power Exchange in the resources section, and look for webinars. And so with that, I will now go to our second presenter, which is Julie Allingham of our project team. And so Julie, I think you're on. Go ahead, and I'll advance the slides, so just let me know when you're ready.
Great, thanks Woody. Welcome everybody. Michael Clausen and I would just like to start this morning's session by briefly reminding you that this webinar is part of a project we're doing with the Center for Climate Protection this year. We want to help build a broader understanding of distributed energy resources and really the unique advantages and opportunities for community choice agencies. So the goal is to accelerate DER planning and development efforts, primarily by the 5 relatively new CCAs in the Peninsula Bay Area, but of course for other CCAs and their advisors around the state as well. We're doing that project because we believe it will drive increased benefits for people in these communities, as well as help build stronger, more differentiated CCAs. So as Woody mentioned, this is the second in a series, and if you missed the first webinar, check that out, please. It was our August webinar, and it set the context for why CCAs should care about DER and opportunities for early action. And another way to kind of get that context quickly is to read the article by Barry Vesser called "Get Ahead of the IDER Wave or Be Crushed by It." It's in the handout section, and that's a really useful article to come up to speed quickly on the background of sort of the goal of our project. So next slide, Woody. So for our project, we define distributed energy resources very broadly, and just a few examples to put out there are like building local solar and storage projects, energy efficiency, EV programs, fuel switching, demand response technologies, microgrids, plus data analytics and smart control systems for integrating all the parts. We all know we're in a very dynamic energy market in California with new technologies and market, legislative, and regulatory changes. So not every investment in integrated DER makes sense now or in the future, but due to the missions of CCAs and the deep customer relationships and local knowledge, they're in a strong position to help maximize the benefits for the public, the environment, and the overall system. CCAs can lead and help create these markets, or at least prepare to join them as they mature. Next slide, Woody. So here's what we have planned for today. Several of you have expressed interest in the value of energy storage for CCAs, their customers, and the distribution grid. There's recognition that to reach our state's 100% renewable energy goals, energy storage must play a strategic role. And many CCAs know that they're well positioned in their communities to play a unique role, but may have limited capacity to assess the best opportunities and most economical approaches for getting started. So our goal is to begin that conversation. As our primary presenter in today's webinar, we're happy to welcome Rick Brown, CEO of TerraVerde Energy. He's got deep knowledge of energy storage and its exciting potential for the CCA movement. So he'll discuss battery storage, the variety of benefits, and some opportunities for CCAs to consider, followed by Cordel Stillman of Sonoma Clean Power, and who will briefly describe SCP's early efforts to reduce commercial and industrial customer costs using energy storage. Also, just as a supplement to today's storage introduction, we've compiled an additional resource that Woody mentioned in the handout section. It highlights some CCA relevant educational presentations from storage organizations that we reached out to, and also example projects from selected potential partners that we reached out to. So please check that out. And if we hear from you that's useful, that resource might grow over time. So with that introduction, let's dive in and get started. Rick?
Okay, I will pull up Rick's, thank you very much, Julie. And I will pull up Rick's slides. And I think I've got it set on the first one. Rick, you ready to go?
Ready to roll.
Great. Okay, you sound pretty good. So just let me know when you want me to switch the slides.
Sure. Thanks, Woody, and thanks, Julie and Michael. This is a great opportunity for us to share what we've learned through our work in implementing battery storage on behalf of customers throughout the state. Next slide. So just a little bit about TerraVerde. So we've been in business since 2009 as an independent energy advisor, primarily working with public agencies throughout California, schools, cities, water agencies, transit agencies, and also more recently CCAs. In terms of our involvement with battery storage, we helped a school district in Tulare County, a low-income school district, actually implement the first solar plus storage project, and that was back in 2014. And the good news is that district has saved over $1.2 million since then on their energy bills. We've also helped implement battery storage at over 50 additional sites, and we have another 25 or so that will be going in the next 3 to 6 months, again, in these public agency settings. Another important thing is that we're working on a grant from the California Energy Commission in partnership with Marin Clean Energy, or MCE, and also with the Center for Climate Protection to develop a tool for CCAs to identify the best locations for DER implementation and how projects could be designed to incentivize customers to put in those DERs to benefit both the customer but also the CCA. And then a second project funded by the National Renewable Energy Lab, again working with the Center for Climate Protection, Lancaster Choice Energy, and Peninsula Clean Energy, to develop a tool, a rate design tool that would allow CCAs to put together specific rate structures that would incentivize the deployment and adoption of DERs within their territories. And we can talk about that at some future point. Next slide. So in thinking about the question of, so where does battery storage fit in for CCAs? There's several questions that we want to try to address today. The first question is, what do CCAs need that battery storage might provide? Flattening load curves to reduce wholesale procurement costs, flexible repeating capacity to reduce exposure to volatile market prices, resource adequacy, resiliency. These are all a number of things that people have talked about, and we'll be sharing some of the ways in which battery storage can meet some of those different needs. And particularly, and this is a critical point, with DERs, we're talking about, for the most part, a situation where the customer provides the capital to install or implement those resources and then enters into some kind of arrangement or agreement, and that agreement allows then the CCA to share the utilization of those batteries for purposes that it had, while the economics for the customer, pay off that financing. So it's an interesting and unique way for a win-win situation between CCAs and their customers. Next slide. So we want to start by just getting into some of the basics. And first, an acronym, AES. Within the industry, battery storage is more commonly described as advanced energy storage. I'll explain why in a second. And the problem for customers that this technology right now is currently being used to address is their demand charge, okay? For many commercial customers, the peak demand part of their utility bill can actually be as much as 30 to 40% of that total bill. And in fact, in recent years, the utilities in California have received approval to increase those demand charges at really significant rates. When we look back over the last 10 years and model what have the generation portion of their bills grown as and what has the demand charge, the generation charge is generally anywhere from 2 to 4%. The demand charges have been growing over the last 10 years closer to 6 to 8%, again, across all utility territories. So finding ways to manage that demand charge of the bill is becoming increasingly important. Next slide. So how are demand charges calculated? They're calculated based on the highest 15-minute interval peak demand within a monthly billing cycle. So for example, if a customer is on a rate structure where the demand charge is $15 per kilowatt, and let's say it's an unusually hot day and their air conditioning units are working extremely hard to keep their buildings at a reasonable comfort level, the demand may spike to 350 kilowatts, even though the sort of average or highest normal demand is somewhere around 200 kilowatts. So that would result in a demand charge of $4,500. Next slide. So while I'm not going to dive deeply into the technology, I do need to talk a little bit about how do batteries reduce those demand charges. So next slide. So the reason we call this advanced energy storage is because a battery, so to speak, is not just a bunch of cells or battery cells. When you install an advanced energy system, you're getting the battery, you're getting an inverter, which is the device that interfaces between that battery and the customer and the grid. You're getting a cooling system for the most part, a communication system, a safety disconnect, and a controller. So there's a lot of different devices that compose when we talk about battery storage, again, for these purposes. It's not about backup, remember. This is about discharging the battery to shave off or reduce the peak demand so that charge, that monthly charge, is also reduced. So the key point here is the battery is installed behind the utility meter. It's monitoring the demand every 10 seconds currently is the standard. It could get to be more frequent than that. And it discharges at those times when, based on its algorithms and how it's looking at the behavior of that customer, it determines that it needs to shave that demand so as to not incur those high demand charges. Next slide. Now, for those of you, now this is an important point. For those of you who are thinking, well, doesn't solar also reduce demand? Yes. From the period, say 12 to 4, yes, solar can reduce demand, but it can't necessarily do it reliably. Think about the fact that sometimes there might be a cloud that comes over for 15, 20, maybe 30 minutes, and the production of that solar drops, say at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when there's still a lot of demand. Then that spike may occur because that solar is not available to offset that spike. So working together, the solar and battery offset that usage and demand charges. Now, the other part is that for many commercial customers, there's a spike in their demand in the early morning when the sun is not very high on the horizon. And so, of course, the solar is not able to reduce the demand there. And if that spike is that highest 15-minute interval spike in that month, you need to have another way of flattening it or shaving it off, and the battery becomes that backup to doing that shaving during that time of the day. So just for those who need to see this more graphically, here's an actual example of demand at a particular school site. And as you can see, in this particular day, somewhere around, it's looking like it's somewhere around 8 o'clock. Again, the example I gave before is when there's that high spike. Imagine, people are showing up at school, they're turning on their lights, they're turning on their cooling devices, there's all kinds of equipment being load being put onto the system. That's where you get that spike. Next slide. And here you can see where while the solar is able to, in that orange line, somewhat reduce that spike in the afternoon. You can see in the morning, the sun's not up very high, so it can't really reduce that spike at that time. So that's where the battery comes in. Next slide. So what you see here now in the green line is the new demand profile. And again, in the morning, you see how the set point for that battery, if you look at that blue box over on the right there, that set point has been made at 75 kilowatts. So as demand increases, at the point at which that demand hits that 75 kilowatts, the battery begins to discharge. It shaves off that peak, and that's where the savings are going to come from. That essentially, it looks like there's about a 20 kilowatt shaving off of that peak. There's other times of the day when it's being shaved also, but the critical one is that spike that occurs there in the evening. And then you see there in the picture how the battery is recharging somewhere around 7 o'clock to be available for the next day. And another way of showing this on the next slide is looking at, again, this is this Burton City Schools. Yeah, go ahead, Woody, to the next slide. So now for those of you who like tables, let's just kind of break it down. So if you look at the first column, the original demand curve, this is the baseline, so to speak. You can see that the highest, or the spiking in demand, is at 8:15 at 92.64 kilowatts. It goes down a little bit, and then it spikes again in the early morning, late morning, and then it spikes again in the late morning. Now, this is on a particular day, okay? You could have a very different profile depending on the time of year, the weather, et cetera, et cetera. And then you show in the next column how the solar has slightly reduced that peak in the morning, but and in the late morning, reduce it even more in the latest part of the morning, but not enough to really be as valuable as when you have the battery discharge. And then, as you can see, the final demand curve in green there is set at 75 kW. So that's the set point. And again, that set point is determined based on some analytics that either the vendor may have provided, or in this case, TerraVerde provided to the customer in terms of the cost benefit. Size of battery versus savings versus cost of battery. What set point's going to get you the best ultimate return on investment? And in this particular case, it was at 75 kW. If for some reason that system or that there's changes in the operations of that facility, you could have that discharge be at a lower set point, but the economics might not be as clear. But for this point, this particular client, that was the case. And so you can see also on the final column, what is the state of the battery after it discharges, how much is available for potential spikes later on. And that kind of gives you an overall sense of how the battery is performing to reduce those demand charges. And again, at $15 a kilowatt in this particular case, if this, the savings here is somewhere around 20 kilowatts, now you're talking about $300 that have been saved based on the use of that battery. And that's what generates the revenue that justifies the capital expense of that battery. Again, this is for 1 day and 1 month. But for this particular battery, we actually, the district saves about $4,000 or $5,000 a year. Okay, over a 10-year period, $45,000 to $50,000. That's where they get the economics there, and that's just for the demand savings. Go to the next slide. So, just in summarize, the benefits of energy storage for the customer is that demand reduction and avoiding those demand charges. It also smooths out the solar production profile from the standpoint of you're also getting some savings in those times when, let's say, the solar is reduced because of cloud cover or whatever, or maybe there's an outage for the solar and the battery kicks in. You're also getting some energy savings, because you're offsetting more expensive power during that afternoon period when you expected the solar to provide that. Next page. Now, if you decided to, if a customer, and we have a few that are now exploring that for obvious reasons, if they decide to tie in a microgrid controller to their battery and solar facility, they could actually have a backup system. They could island themselves from the grid during grid outages to provide power to critical loads. We have a school district that has lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars in food costs because at their operations center, while they had solar, they didn't have battery storage. And when the grid went out and the refrigerators were down for more than 6 hours under, food safety rules, they had to throw out all that food. So we're going to be putting a battery into that system, having a microgrid controller, and they will then avoid those potential losses in the future. Now, one of the other benefits is that there is an incentive for battery storage known as SGIP, Self-Generation Incentive Program. That program was almost eliminated, but with some heroic efforts from Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco and the California Solar and Storage Association, that program was extended for the next 10 years under a bill called SB 700. The other benefit for customers is that there are many, just like a PPA for solar, there are no capital investment contracts similar to solar PPAs, where essentially the arrangement is that whatever savings the customer gets from the demand charge reduction from those batteries, they share those savings with the vendor. And that's, they don't have to put anything on their balance sheet. It's just a contract. And that is sort of, for most of our clients, the preferred way to go. And then a new opportunity or benefit that's coming along is known as TOU arbitrage. Many of you may be familiar that with the proliferation of solar in the afternoon, of course, the supply-demand imbalance is changing. And so the peak period in terms of that supply-demand imbalance is going to be moving into the 4 to 9 o'clock period when solar really is not all that effective in offsetting load. Recently, the CPUC ruled that they're willing to consider having a situation where if a solar facility charges a battery, that battery can discharge during that 4 to 9 period and get net metering credits, providing additional economic benefit for that customer. That ruling that process is underway. We don't know where that's going to go, but that direction is a policy direction is coming. Next slide.
Yeah, but Rick, I'll just add I think most folks on the call know that a TOU stands for time of use, but just in case there's anyone on the webinar that's new to this, that's time of use.
Thanks. So then let's get to now that we've gone through the basics, let's talk about, so more immediately, how can batteries or customer-based batteries help CCAs? There has been a state requirement under AB 2514 that every load-serving entity, including CCAs, had to have at least 1% of their load covered by batteries by 2020. Actually, it's my understanding that that requirement has been met through a process that the CCAs have been involved with. I'm not all that familiar with the specifics there, but my understanding is that requirement has been met already. I would not be surprised, however, if the legislature doesn't up the ante and continue to increase that requirement. And again, these behind-the-meter customer-owned batteries can be and have been used to meet those state requirements. But a more important benefit for CCAs is load shaping. Obviously, one of the key factors impacting a CCA in procuring wholesale is the load shape. In other words, the peakier the load, the more it costs to serve that load. And by having customers implement and install batteries, and for their own benefit, flattening out that load, as you saw in some of those pictures, that benefit also accrues to whoever is serving those customers. And additionally, CCAs could establish arrangements with the battery owners themselves and say, hey, if you discharge those batteries at times when we really need to flatten our load, because for many CCAs, it's not the commercial customer load that's the problem, it's the residential customer load when people come home in the evening, right? And there's all kinds of demands put on the grid for more power. If the CCA had an arrangement with those customers to discharge during that time, that would be an additional benefit, a key benefit for the CCA in reducing its cost of procurement. Now, we've tested this model in an interesting and analogous way. We have a large school district in the Central Valley who happens to purchase their energy through a a direct access contract. Essentially, they were one of the ones who had the ability to buy wholesale for their electricity. We then implemented at that district solar and battery storage. And we talked to their DA provider, their direct access provider, and said, because we thought this would be the case, by us putting on that solar and storage, did we sufficiently flatten out their load, in other words, reduce the peakiness of their load, such that their ability to procure wholesale at a lower cost was able to happen. And in fact, in that particular case, the provider said, yeah, we've noticed that, and their procurement costs went down, 6 to 8%, because of just having those batteries and solar flattening out that load. There wasn't any particular load shaping algorithm or approach, but just by the fact that they were there, it accrued that benefit. Well, I'm not promising that putting batteries in a CCA is going to reduce your wholesale procurement costs by 6 to 8%, but clearly there is some way in which doing that can help a CCA reduce that major cost, which is procuring wholesale. Now, then there's the load shifting question. As overall peak demand is shifting into the evening, it is increasingly important for CCAs to find ways to reduce their demand during that period. As I mentioned before, again, working out arrangements with customers who have these batteries to not just discharge them when they have the commercial customers, in many cases, many commercial customers don't have peak demand or significant demand in the evening. And so those batteries could be made available to discharge during those periods to, again, reduce the cost of power during that evening on their wholesale procurement. And then a fourth benefit is, again, resource adequacy. Before this call, I was on a call with one of my clients who has batteries and who is negotiating with different providers who want to use their batteries to support resource adequacy contracts that the California Independent System Operator, also known as CAISO, has put out, and they're going to basically, share the revenue with these providers at their location. There's no reason that CCAs also couldn't meet some of their resource adequacy needs with, again, customer-owned batteries under these kinds of arrangements. Next slide. And then Julie alluded to this earlier, but there also are potential, revenue opportunities, grid services, voltage regulation, et cetera, that there's experiments and pilots going on where batteries are being used to meet certain grid management needs, and otherwise known as ancillary services. And again, this is an opportunity with the CCA. Individual customers may have a harder time negotiating and or managing those kinds of arrangements with either the distribution grid operator or the CAISO. But the CCA is in a unique position to go to its commercial customers who have batteries and say, hey, we'll be the interface point. We'll aggregate, another use of the aggregation capability of CCAs. We'll aggregate batteries across our particular territory, and we'll bid them into these grid services markets, and then becomes a revenue source for the CCA, but of course they share with those battery owners. Another way to generate revenue for the CCA to help ratepayers by reducing their overall operating costs. So these are some of the ways that CCAs can benefit from batteries. I'm just going to go to the last slide, which are a couple of pages of frequently asked questions that we can come back to, but I want to make sure we give Cordel plenty of time to talk about his case example. But as you can see here, here's some of the frequently asked questions. You can go to the next slide, Woody. And glad to get into some of these or any other questions you have after we turn it over to Cordel. So I'll leave it there, and we'll see what questions you have when we come back. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rick. And yeah, folks, be sure to, if you have questions, be sure to enter them into the control panel there, and Nina will be ready to read them out when we get to that section. So we are now ready for you, Cordel. Don't forget to unmute yourself or get yourself. Are you on audio?
I am, Woody. Yeah, I'm a pro, so I'm on.
Good.
Hopefully, I'm not muted.
Sounds good. You sound great. Thanks, Cordel. Take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to go over a program that we've had running for a bit of time now, and go over the genesis of that, how we got started, and what some of our early results are. So next slide, Woody. Some basic information about us. Sonoma Clean Power serves Sonoma counties and Mendocino County. Our total customers are in the low 220s. And what we try to do is, with our programs, is provide added value to our customers. We are in a competitive environment, so anything that we can do to separate ourselves from the independent, investor-owned utilities is a bonus for us. It builds customer loyalty, and that's one of the tenets of our programs here at Sonoma Clean Power. Next slide. So our customer service folks came to us and asked us to try and come up with some ideas for programs for our commercial customers. They are our largest customers, obviously, and they're a significant revenue base for us. So we wanted to get ourselves in front of them, show our value to them over the investor-owned utility, and so that's what we did in programs is put our heads together and came up with demand charge reduction as a potential program. As was alluded to beforehand, the demand charges are a significant portion of commercial customers' bills. And again, is very well laid out for you in the previous speaker, the potential to reduce costs using storage. And again, we look to add value in this whole process. Sorry, these slides look like they were put together by a 10-year-old, and that's probably a good analogy for my skill at PowerPoint. Next slide, Woody. So initially, what we did is we wanted to learn more about battery storage in general and the companies that provided these services. So we put out an RFI just asking for companies to come and to explain to us what their services were, what value they could add for our customers, and how we might take advantage of the technologies that they had at hand. From that, based on that information, we put out an RFP to battery storage companies. Basic idea behind this was that we, as a CCA, have access to a lot of data, the 15-minute interval data that we can look at and determine which companies are going to benefit from a battery storage project. So what our idea was is that we will provide anonymized data to a company, and they determine, what companies would be the best fit for these programs. And also, we ask the companies to provide us with some monetary incentive to work with them, some kind of a discount for our customers if we gave them these introductions to our customers. And that's exactly what we ended up doing. Also, Sonoma Clean Power is not involved in the ultimate transaction between the customer and the battery storage company. So we're only acting as a catalyst for this type of a program. So next slide, Woody. As I mentioned, the RFI went out in January of 2018. We spent a few months analyzing that. The RFP went out in March of 2018. And after analyzing the results of our solicitation and several interviews with different companies, we selected STEM as our partner. And they were the only company that came in and really knocked our socks off as far as their understanding of what we were looking for and their ability to provide a lower cost to our customers, a better financial deal for our customers than the other folks that we spoke with. So we began reaching out to customers in May of 2018, and we've had, surprisingly to us, limited success. And that's one of the things we do here at Sonoma Clean Power is if we try an idea and it's not successful, then we have some more data to work with. I can't name any particular customers because of confidentiality rules, but we did approach 10 or 15 of our larger customers, and each one of them, it was predicted they could save anywhere between $50,000 and $150,000 a year on their demand charges. But what we found is that a lot of companies just don't have the bandwidth to contemplate projects of this nature. They're already running at full tilt. They're already bare bones as far as staff time, and even with some help from us, they just didn't have that. I guess the best analogy is bandwidth. We do have several companies that are working with us, one commercial and two government agencies, and we think that several of those may go forward. But again, we were fairly surprised that even with particularly large savings on demand charges, some of these companies just didn't think it was worth their time to move forward. A program like this might work better in an area that has a much more solid commercial base. We're not, a large manufacturing region or an area where it has, a lot of that type of activity. So someplace down in the Bay Area, I'm thinking Silicon Valley or the East Bay, where they do have that more commercial and industrial base, this program like this might be more effective. And in the interest of time, I'm going to close up now and look forward to your questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cordel. And I will pull up, I believe, the one for me to do. Should have done this a different way. Right. So let's just go back to this one here. And Nina, are you ready to read off? Hopefully we've got some questions, folks. Please, if you haven't yet, type your questions in the question box there in your panel. And Nina, are you able to start reading any of the questions for us?
Yes. So this one is for Cordel. What benefits does Sonoma Clean Power reap when STEM deploys a battery? Specifics would be appreciated.
The benefit we reap is helping out our customer. Again, that's, from a customer service standpoint, the more touches we get with our customers, particularly positive ones, are good in our competitive environment. We did not mess with STEM's business model. They do have some ancillary benefits that I'm sure that they are working on aggregating, and we're not getting involved in that at this point. That's something that they have talked with us about potentially in the future, where we could work with them on that. And it does, batteries installed in our territory do go towards our storage mandate. Rick mentioned that before, that he thought it might have been covered, but the storage mandate does go by territory. So if we get a battery installed in our territory, that counts against our mandate.
Okay, we have another question. This is for Rick regarding your school example. Battery recharges in the evening, presumably from the grid. Any way to improve the carbon profile of power to recharge the battery?
Yeah, really good point. And this is an issue that can you all hear me? My phone.
Yes. Yeah, Rick.
This is an important issue. I mean, obviously, the best way to make that happen is for the customer to be in a CCA where they're taking the 100% green tariff, right? We all want that to happen. But in those situations where the power that's being provided and that is being used to charge that battery is not 100% green, then it's obviously, it may be providing economic benefits, but it's not providing greenhouse gas reduction benefits. We actually have some customers where solar doesn't make sense with some of the problems with the net metering rules and the TOU shift, the time of use shift. We have customers who really solar does not pencil, but batteries do in terms of their demand charges. And in order for them, under the new rules associated with the self-generation incentive program, that battery incentive I talked about, those batteries have to be charged at least 75% with solar. And so in some cases, what we're doing is actually sizing a solar facility to just charge the battery. It's not really being sized to offset the generation. It's being sized to charge the battery so that it has that green power, and then can be used for both the demand charge reduction and some of the time of use period arbitrage that I mentioned earlier. So it is an important issue. The greener we get the grid, though, by having everybody go CCA, the better in terms of avoiding that problem, that charging problem.
Other questions, Nina?
Yes, this one is for Cordel. Is Sonoma Clean Power, do the demand charges project savings dependent on tax incentives, i.e. are there savings if a nonprofit like a school or church were interested?
I don't believe there's any difference between a nonprofit and a commercial. as far as their power bills, they don't get any benefit as a non-taxed entity.
Yeah, the key point is whether or not the rate structure that a commercial entity is on, be it a school, a nonprofit, or a private business. Now, there is one situation that should be aware of, which is that there is a rate structure in PG&E territory known as A6. And under A6, there are no demand charges. And that's why that rate structure has historically been used by a lot of folks who have gone solar, because then their solar can offset their entire bill. Now, there's limits on where and how you can use that A6. But, you know, when I gave that example of the school district that had solar but not a battery, in that particular case, the reason they didn't have a battery is because the battery wouldn't have given them any benefit in demand charges because they were on the A6 rate structure. They're installing the battery purely for the backup purpose and eventually TOU arbitrage that I mentioned in terms of being able to island from the grid. So there are some nuances, but it really, ultimately, whether a battery is going to save a customer on their demand charges mostly has to do with the nature of their demand curve. You know, how spiky and where in the day is that, and during the year, are those spikes in demand. If you can imagine, if you have a demand profile where your demand is relatively flat, there's not a lot of spikes, well, the battery's not going to really be able to economically shave off that peak. And so we probably disqualify as many, you know, I would say when we do the analyses here, we probably disqualify half of the projects we look at around battery storage. And that may be some of the problem that SCP is having because in getting its battery program out, because the nature of the demand profile, whether demand may be high, the nature of that profile may not be conducive to the shaving strategy that we were talking about. And that, you know, where we found demand charges the highest are in places like the Central Valley or the Inland Empire down south, where there's a lot of air conditioning use. And when they have to crank up those air conditioners at, you know, 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a huge spike in their demand. And that's where batteries seem to have the most economies. In a more coastal kind of environment like Sonoma County, where, yeah, you still may use air conditioners, but you may not have that same sort of, you know, sort of huge spike, then the economics may not be as good. And that may be one of the reasons why there hasn't been quite as much uptake. With this TOU arbitrage, though, once that ruling, you know, comes through, the economics for locations like in Sonoma County might get better, but that's probably a good 6 to 12 months away.
Okay, another question for Cordel. Who did you typically reach out to at companies for the storage value proposition? Facilities managers, CFOs, or others?
Well, we do have relationships with our larger customers just through our customer service group, and they have a variety of folks that they deal with. Generally, it's the person paying the bill, but then when we work through them, we wanted to talk to the facilities managers to when we actually go out and pitch the idea.
Okay, this one is for Rick.
I would concur. Yeah, let me just add, I would concur with Cordel. In 90% of the time with our clients, the first contact was the person who pays the bill, because this is less about the technology, so to speak, than about the financial benefit. But again, you have to get the maintenance, the facilities people involved, but usually it's the person who pays the bill. Yep, sorry.
No problem. This one's for you. Can you explain the economics of a CCA paying commercial customers just for the energy value for discharging energy to offset the CCA's costs of serving residential customers?
In 25 words or less?
Yes.
Yeah. That is a bit of a complicated question, and honestly, there's so many different variables in that question. I'm going to have to punt, and I'll take that. I'm sure you'll keep these questions.
Yes.
I'll take that question offline, sit down with my gang, and we'll get you a written answer to that question. But
Yeah.
it's a little, there's too many pieces for me to sort of just respond directly right now. Sorry.
Thank you, Rick. This is Woody, and I just want to say, folks, for that question, and for any, if we don't get to all the questions, and if your question, if you don't feel it was fully answered or whatever, we're happy to follow up with you and work with Rick and Cordel and flesh out the responses to your answers. So yeah, we can take that one up after the webinar. Further questions, Nina?
Yeah, we have a few more here. For Cordel, since STEM was decided to be the main partner, have more battery storage companies other than STEM shown more interest or incentives to support the SCP program?
We haven't had any real follow-ups or other companies that have come in and tried to talk us out of STEM. We still are in contact with several other battery manufacturers and battery companies because of other projects we're working on. And I do want to add that if anybody is interested in the RFI, the RFP, or our contract with STEM, those are all public record, and I'd be happy to share those with anybody who'd like to take a look at them. And you can go through, Woody has my contact information and can get me in touch.
Okay, this one is for Rick. This is going back to the school example again. Doesn't recharging at 7 p.m. make your storage system ineligible for the ITC and SGIP?
In that particular case, that's right. This particular system did not use the ITC. It's a school district that owns the battery, so they couldn't monetize those tax credits anyway. In that particular case, this was a relatively small site compared to the full portfolio, and so they actually still met the SGIP requirements at that time. Those requirements are getting tighter, so they probably wouldn't be eligible if they use that particular charging strategy in the under the current and future rules. But for the they were an early adopter, and so there's a little more leeway around that. But that's really good question. In order to get that ITC, for those of you who don't know what that is, the investment tax credit, right? And to get the SGIP rebate, the batteries essentially have to be, pretty much seen as connected to the solar facility in terms of, the interconnection and the metering and where they get their, what percentage of their charging comes from solar. It had to meet a certain threshold. So that's a really good question. Just tagging on to Cordel, we also have, if you are a customer who is wanting to look at an analysis of your load, we can do those analytics also. We will do initial feasibility study, at no cost, because our interest is only doing projects that make sense. And if a project doesn't pencil, we're going to tell you. And like I said, probably half the time, and we tell folks, don't waste your money, don't waste your time on this from an economic standpoint. Occasionally someone will say to us, we want to do it anyway, even though it's not going to save us money. And we're like, okay, just as long as you understand the economics here are not going to work for you right now. So we will provide that kind of support and show you those models to get a more specific sense of how the ins and outs of the sort of economics that are associated with these kind of projects.
Okay, this next question isn't targeted at anyone, so either of you can chime in on it. Is there any mitigation for changes in tariff structures that might make demand charges less significant portion of the customer bill and therefore damage the business case for this storage?
You take that one, Rick.
I mean, the issue is really a policy or rate structure risk, right? We just talked about the fact that the peak period is changing in commercial rate structures, right? And we've had net metering policy 1.0, we've had net metering policy 2.0, And in fact, this year, the CPUC is going to go down the path of creating net metering policy 3.0. There's always a risk of changes in the rate structures and, you know, how much is peak demand versus coincident demand, et cetera, et cetera. In general, however, the policy of the state has been, if you put a technology out there under a certain set of policy rules, they're going to give you a grandfathering period so that, you know, you're not harmed or significantly harmed by having been an adopter at a time when a set of policies was set up. There's no guarantee of that in the future, but that has been their historical practice. So while you know, we have projects that are, for example, say in their 5th year of being on solar, and the peak period is moving into the evening, that would if that was applied to them today, that would significantly degrade their economics, 20 to 25%, for example. They're being, you know, the CPUC gave them a grandfathering period of 10 years from inception of the project. So they have 5 more years under the current time of use periods, and then their benefit will go down. But by having had 10 years under the current period, their economics was really good. And, you know, if it's degraded a little bit at that 10-year period, it's not like they're going underwater. So there's no specific answer to this question other than, you know, the general policy of the state has been to protect people who adopted technologies under a particular policy and rate regime.
Maybe one more, Nina, and then I should probably do the wrap up.
Okay. So last question here. Aren't opportunities based upon regulatory artifacts such as demand charges risky? For instance, IOUs may find a new way to replace revenue and abandon demand charges in the future.
And again, this is similar to the previous question. It is possible that they will demand a particular approach to demand charges. But again, one of the interesting things about batteries, let's say based on that, you know, let's say there is grandfathering that's of a more limited nature. I still think that people will be grandfathered, but let's assume that the grandfathering isn't the best. One of the interesting things about batteries is that they have so many different possible uses. We've mostly been focusing on, again, the demand charge reduction component of their usage. And that does not necessarily help everybody, even today, because, you know, and Cordel's example of how many people have taken up this really unique program that they're offering. But you know, assuming that we do go forward, and I think we have confidence that we go forward with this time of use arbitrage opportunity, that's another benefit. I was mentioning to you this pilot. So we have a customer who has 1.25 megawatts of battery storage across 5 high schools within their district. Okay. The bids that we are seeing, this is on top of the demand charge reduction they're getting. The bids that we're seeing for having those batteries available under this pilot program are in the range of $50,000 per megawatt year, or in this case, about $62,000 for this school district. This is on top of the demand charge savings that they already have. In addition, they are being considered for bidding into some day-ahead markets, which could add another $15,000 to $20,000. So, and that's just this one little pilot. The point here is, if you believe that the state, that the way in which the grid is going to have to manage itself into the future involves having very flexible resources like batteries, there's going to be many, many other opportunities to generate revenues from these devices besides just the demand charge reductions. So even if there is some, you know, elimination in the future, there's the grandfathering opportunity, and then there's this benefit of the dispatchability and flexibility of these resources that are likely to bring other economics.
Great points, Rick. And with that, I think we need to bring it to a close. So thank you very much, Rick and Cordel. Excellent presentations. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Julie and Michael and the rest of the Adobe team. And thank you, Nina. And just a couple of dates and reminders here. There is coming up tomorrow the InfoCast Community Choice Summit at Hotel Kabuki in San Francisco. You probably still buy tickets. I don't think they're sold out. I'll be presenting tomorrow in the pre-summit workshop on the fundamentals of community choice. Our next webinar, the date has been set, Wednesday, January 23rd at 11 a.m. The topic and the presenters will be announced at a later date, but maybe just pencil that date in your calendar. And that is my contact information for any questions or follow-up. If we did not get to your questions, we apologize for that, but we do like to, out of respect for everyone's time, start on time and close on time. So it is noon by my clock, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you can join us for future webinars, and enjoy the holiday season all. And that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much.